Meantime, while he'd been traveling back, his wife Alexandra, who was at the palace with the 5 children, had been placed under house arrest. And when Nicholas came back, he too was effectively told, "You're now a prisoner, you're under house arrest here."
July 1991. Deep in a Russian forest, scientists unearthed the grave of the Romanovs, and a new mystery began. 5 royal bodies were recovered, but 2 children were missing. For decades, the world clung to the hope of a lost princess, driven by legends and an imposter whose secrets split families and fueled a global obsession. But when DNA evidence challenged everything we believed, history itself was forced to confess. What truth lay buried with the missing heirs, and why did we want to believe a lie? The forest at Porosenkov Log held its secrets for more than 70 years. In the summer of 1991, under the watch of Russian authorities and a team of forensic scientists, shovels broke the soil where rumor and old testimony had pointed for decades. The site was unmarked, overgrown, and silent except for the scrape of metal against earth. As layers of dirt fell away, the outlines of a shallow pit took shape. Within, 9 sets of bones lay scattered together, mixed, jumbled, and stained by time. The remains included adults and children, their skeletons tangled with shards of cloth, buttons, and jewelry fragments. Some bones showed signs of trauma, fractures, bullet holes, and deep gouges that matched the chaos described by executioners in their written confessions. Field leaders cataloged every find. They measured femurs and skulls, logged teeth, and sifted through the remnants of royal insignia and civilian dress. The grave contained 2 adult skeletons, 3 smaller juvenile skeletons, and 4 more adults, each one carefully lifted, tagged, and prepared for laboratory study. Early forensic analysis suggested the presence of Nicholas II and Alexandra, their 3 daughters, and 4 loyal servants, including Dr. Botkin, the cook, the valet, and the maid. The arrangement of the bones, the hurried burial, and the mingling of royal and domestic artifacts all pointed to a rushed, secretive disposal. Chemical traces lingered in the soil, evidence of acid used to destroy faces and hands, just as described in Soviet-era memoirs. For the scientists on site, the work was painstaking. Each fragment of bone and each scrap of fabric was a potential clue. They documented the grave's position with surveyor's tools, mapped the distribution of remains, and photographed every layer as it was revealed. The grave's location matched the coordinates given in Yakov Yurovsky's decades-old account, lending fresh weight to the story of a midnight execution and a desperate cover-up. Yet, as the last bones were lifted from the ground, the team counted only 9 bodies. The family's youngest son and 1 daughter were missing. The grave, once a rumor, was now a crime scene, and the evidence it offered would soon face the most rigorous scrutiny science could provide. Word of the missing Romanov children spread quickly beyond the excavation site. The official count was 9 bodies, not 11, and it landed like a challenge to both faith and history. In Moscow, church leaders hesitated to accept the findings. The Russian Orthodox hierarchy, still haunted by decades of secrecy and martyrdom, questioned whether the grave truly contained the Tsar's family. Without the remains of Tsarevich Alexei and 1 daughter, the church refused to grant full recognition, treating the burial as unresolved and the souls as lost to history. Monarchist circles, both inside Russia and among emigre communities abroad, seized on the gap. For them, the absence of the heir and a daughter was more than a forensic puzzle. It was a spark of hope. Pamphlets and editorials speculated that the Bolsheviks, desperate to cover their crime, might have hidden the children elsewhere or even spared them. The notion of a living Romanov, especially the young Alexei, became a rallying cry for royalist nostalgia and political dissent. Debates erupted in academic halls and on television screens. Forensic scientists pointed to DNA matches and anthropological evidence, but skeptics pressed harder. They questioned the chain of custody, the reliability of early 1990s lab work, and the integrity of the investigation itself. Some argued that the state was eager to close the case, to bury a painful chapter of Russian history, even if it meant ignoring inconvenient details. The legend of survival grew stronger in the absence of proof. Church leaders called for patience and prayer, refusing to sanctify the remains until every child was accounted for. Monarchist writers published lists of supposed sightings and escape stories, feeding a public hungry for miracles. For a brief moment, the empty spaces in the grave made the impossible seem plausible. The world was left with a question. If 2 children were missing, could one of them have truly escaped? That sliver of doubt would fuel a global search for living heirs and open the door to those who claimed the Romanov name. In February 1920, a young woman was pulled from the icy waters of Berlin's Landwehr Canal. She had no identification, refused to speak, and bore scars across her body, marks that puzzled the doctors at Daldorf Asylum. Hospital staff registered her as Fräulein Unbekannt, which means Miss Unknown. For months, she hovered between silence and confusion, her past locked behind trauma and a wall of amnesia. Yet, as time passed, her story began to change the world around her. Word spread among Berlin's émigré community about the mysterious patient with haunted eyes and wounds that seemed too severe for an ordinary life. Some visitors whispered that her features, her jawline, her ears, the curve of her nose, looked uncannily like the youngest daughter of the last Russian Tsar. One detail in particular caught attention: a bunion on her right foot, hallux valgus, just like the one visible in photographs of Grand Duchess Anastasia. Doctors noted this deformity, and supporters seized on it as a royal signature, even as skeptics pointed out that such a feature was hardly unique. Her hands and arms bore scars that looked like the aftermath of violence, some deep, some faded, all unexplained. Her abdomen showed an old surgical wound, and her scalp carried the trace of a head injury. In the minds of those desperate for a miracle, these wounds became evidence of a miraculous escape from a Bolshevik firing squad. The narrative took root. Perhaps she had survived the massacre and endured a perilous journey west, hidden by loyalists, scarred but alive. By 1922, she began to speak. When pressed about her identity, she denied being Tatiana, but quietly, almost reluctantly, suggested she was Anastasia. Supporters arrived from across Europe, some of whom had known the Romanovs before the revolution. Gleb Botkin, son of the family's murdered physician, became her most passionate advocate. He was convinced by her mannerisms, her posture, and what seemed to be intimate knowledge of palace life. She described the layout of the Winter Palace and the Alexander Palace with a confidence that unsettled even the most skeptical. She recalled hidden doors, the pattern of the wallpaper in the children's rooms, and the pet names used within the family. On several occasions, she recognized old family friends, greeting them with private nicknames or recalling stories that, to her supporters, could only be known by someone who had lived among the Romanovs. Her circle grew. Aristocrats, exiled courtiers, and even a few distant Romanov relatives visited her, some leaving convinced, others departing in disbelief. The debate spilled into newspapers and drawing rooms, dividing families and fueling rumors in cities from Paris to New York. The scars, the foot, the stories, each detail became a clue and a mystery that seemed to defy resolution. For Anna Anderson, as she came to be known, the boundaries between memory and invention blurred. Her supporters saw a lost princess, battered but unbroken. Her doubters saw a troubled woman shaped by trauma and the hopes of those around her. But the legend had taken hold. In the absence of proof, her story became a living question, a promise that somewhere, against all odds, the last spark of the Romanov dynasty might have survived. A single block of preserved tissue, stored in a hospital pathology archive since 1979, would finally settle the question that had haunted courts and families for decades. After Anna Anderson died in Virginia in 1984, her story seemed destined to remain an open wound, no confession, no proof, only divided memories and a legacy of doubt. But science was catching up. In 1994, forensic geneticists in Britain and the United States began to extract DNA from that old surgical sample. Their goal was to compare Anderson's genetic code to the living maternal line of the Romanovs, a lineage that ran straight through Queen Victoria to Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. Prince Philip's blood provided the royal benchmark. Mitochondrial DNA, passed unchanged from mother to child, offered a simple, unbreakable link. Scientists sequenced the control region of Anderson's mitochondrial DNA and ran it side by side with Prince Philip's. The result was not a subtle mismatch or a shadow of uncertainty, it was a complete disconnection. At every key position, Anderson's mitochondrial DNA diverged sharply from the Romanov profile. There was no maternal relationship. The probability that Anna Anderson was the daughter of Tsarina Alexandra stood at 0. The test did more than rule out royalty. Investigators turned to the family of Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who had vanished in 1920, just before Anna Anderson surfaced in Berlin. Living relatives of Szankowska provided their own DNA samples. When Anderson's mitochondrial sequence was compared to theirs, the match was exact. The genetic code was shared, inherited down the maternal line. The woman who had captivated Europe as a possible duchess was, in fact, a missing laborer from Pomerania. The evidence left no room for legend. The United Kingdom's Forensic Science Service and the United States Armed Forces DNA Identification Laboratory repeated the analysis using independent extracts from the tissue block. The same result appeared again and again. Mitochondrial DNA from Anderson's preserved intestine matched the Szankowska family and no one else. There was no possibility of a laboratory mix-up. Controls, blanks, and replication in separate countries all pointed to the same conclusive conclusion. For the scientists who had watched the Anastasia case drift through generations of rumor, the verdict was final. In the language of the lab, the probability that Anderson was a Romanov was as low as any forensic case could measure. The probability she was Franziska Szankowska was overwhelming. The scars, the foot, the stories, each detail that had once seemed miraculous now fit a different, far less glamorous puzzle. The imposter was unmasked, not by confession or cross-examination, but by the silent logic of DNA. With Anderson's claim closed, the search for the missing Romanov children could finally move from the realm of courtroom drama to the cold ground of the Siberian forest. The question of survival had been answered for Anna Anderson, but the fate of the Tsar's youngest son and daughter still waited in the earth, beyond the reach of rumor and the reach of hope. In the summer of 2007, a group of volunteers swept metal detectors through a thicket of birch trees just 70 meters from the original Romanov grave. The ground was uneven and littered with debris, but a faint reading stopped them. Beneath the moss and roots, they unearthed not full skeletons, but a scatter of brittle fragments, some no larger than a coin. The inventory grew: 44 bone pieces, a handful of teeth, and warped metal from what once might have been clothing fasteners or cartridge casings. Every fragment bore the scars of violence, charred, cracked, and pitted by acid. The soil itself was stained, holding traces of chemicals that had seeped through for decades. Archaeologists worked with fine brushes and tweezers, logging each find by number and location. The pit was shallow, barely deep enough to shield its contents from the freeze and thaw of Russian winters. Unlike the first grave, these remains were not arranged but scattered and broken, as if someone had tried to erase them from memory. The burning had been intense. Bone edges crumbled at the touch, and some pieces were fused together by heat. Acid had eaten through the outer layers, dissolving the surfaces and leaving a chalky residue. The team mapped the site with surveyor's tape, marking the precise distance from the 1991 grave. The proximity left little doubt this was not a random burial. The pattern matched old confessions, 2 bodies separated from the rest, destroyed with fire and acid, then hastily buried apart. Each fragment was bagged and tagged for the lab. The hope was slim. Chemical damage and fire had stripped away much of the evidence. But the searchers pressed on, knowing that even the smallest sliver of bone could carry a genetic code. The physical link to the Romanov tragedy was now undeniable, waiting for science to unlock its secrets. For nearly a century, the story of Anastasia's escape refused to die. The myth flourished in the shadows left by Soviet secrecy, where official files stayed locked and the truth of the Romanovs' fate was a forbidden subject. In those gaps, imagination took root. Exiled Russians clung to the hope of a living heir, someone who might restore a lost world or redeem a national tragedy. For émigré communities in Paris, Berlin, and New York, the legend of a surviving princess was more than a rumor. It was a lifeline to the past, a symbol that the old order might one day return. Popular culture took the legend and wove it into something irresistible. In 1956, Hollywood gave audiences Ingrid Bergman as a haunted, elegant Anastasia, her true identity revealed only in the final ambiguous frames. The film sidestepped the horror of the cellar and the gunshots, trading them for candlelight, ballrooms, and the possibility of a happy ending. Decades later, the 1997 animated musical swept away any trace of tragedy, sending its amnesiac heroine to Paris, where memory and love conquered all. Each retelling softened the violence and sharpened the longing for a miracle. The myth's endurance was not just a matter of censorship or nostalgia, it offered comfort in the face of unspeakable loss. The idea that a child could survive the chaos of revolution, slip through the cracks of history and reclaim her name was a balm for a world exhausted by war and upheaval. Even as evidence mounted against the legend, the desire for a fairy tale ending proved stronger than the facts. The lost princess became a stand-in for innocence itself, a way to believe that some part of the old world could be saved. For many, accepting the truth meant facing the full brutality of the past. A family gunned down, children buried in secret, a dynasty erased without a trace of mercy. The legend survived because it was easier to imagine a miracle than to confront that darkness. Anne Anderson's story thrived because the world needed it to. In the end, the myth outlived its maker, echoing through novels, films, and whispered stories long after science had closed the case. Science can silence legends, but it cannot erase our need for hope in the face of horror. Even as DNA closes historical mysteries, new myths rise to fill the void. The Romanov case reminds us that the facts matter, but so do the stories we choose to believe. Which truth stays with you? Let us know in the comments.